wherever you go, however you go. For energy on the go, it's got to be 5-Hour Energy. Works fast, works long, tastes good. 5-Hour Energy. Energy on the go. And 5-Hour Energy. Energy on the go. 5-Hour Energy. Energy on the go. 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 Energy on the go.
I'm new to this, so I'm not sure that I'm new to this, so I'm not sure that I'm okay, what is the noise? Okay, what is the noise? Okay, what is the noise? One moment. 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 Yeah, I'm getting some headphones. 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 Yeah. Is that better? Okay, is it still feeding back? There might be like one of these stupid programs feeding back into itself. Yeah, okay, hold on. Just let me make sure that everything's kind of like muted. Because I'm kind of stupid. This is kind of new. Okay, how about now?
Is that okay? That seems fine. Okay. Sorry for our initial technical difficulties there. All right. This is complicated. All right. All right. Well, thanks for joining me, everybody. I don't know how many people are here. Maybe more than 2 or 3. That's awesome. Looks like there's a few people. There's like at least one person hanging out in the Twitch. A couple people in the YouTube. So please feel free to leave comments. I will see them and try to respond to any questions that you have. But before I do that, let me start a little bit more formally again, and then I can put this up, like later and be like, pretend like I'm not an idiot. No. All right. Constructive. This is why these things have moderators, isn't it? But, whatever. All right. Thanks to everybody who has tuned in. I'm Will Wilkinson, and I'm going to chat with you a little bit today about the article that I had in the New York Times this morning. It's called "Don't Abolish Billionaires." Share your unpopular opinion, I guess. So first I'll kind of walk through the piece a little bit. And then after that, I'll start fielding your questions about it. So let me kick this thing up here. So, as many of you will have noticed, billionaires are not the most popular people in the world right now, and that makes a lot of sense because the President of the United States is a famous billionaire. He says he's a billionaire, and he's kind of one of the worst individuals in existence, and he represents a particular kind of incredibly seedy wealth that there is a lot of and too much of. My previous piece in the Times, I think, was called, "Can Democrats Drain Trump's Gilded Swamp?" or something like that. And I draw out the extent to which we've got this, growing, proliferating class of super wealthy people like Donald Trump who got that way almost entirely from grift. Trump's fortune seems to be largely based on tax evasion. Um, his father had a real estate empire and dodged a ton of his taxes, and that's what he had to pass along to his heirs, and then they structured his estate in an egregiously, both criminal and non-criminally suspicious sort of way. Um, I think that kind of wealth is rampant. We're being damaged deeply by it. There's this sort of nexus of international, state plutocrats, the Saudis, Putin and his oligarchs in Russia, and they're kind of infecting everything. There's a lot of reasons to be not especially happy about billionaires right now. No, but that's not the whole story. As I note in my piece, it's just a standard left-leaning talking point. Not a talking point, a point of conviction for socialist progressives that there is just no justification to a runaway level of income and wealth inequality. That it's just completely outrageous that some people would have so much while some people are dying from want. They can't get their radiation therapy for their kid's leukemia, and somebody else is trying to plan a trip to Mars. There's something really screwy about that. And I agree with that. I think that it's unjustifiable to have those kind of extremes of deprivation and suffering in such a wealthy society. There's nothing that excuses that. But that's not just, there's been a kind of populist surge that Trump was part of, that Bernie Sanders was part of, that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think, has been the biggest part of. And so the thing in my piece that I really riffed off of is Ocasio-Cortez's one of her policy advisors, Dan Riffle, changed his tag on Twitter to every billionaire is a policy failure. And I was like, as someone trained as a philosopher and political theorist, anytime somebody makes a an every claim, you're kind of like, oh, surely there's some philosopher who's not a policy failure. And sure enough, so the piece concentrates on, I'm going to say, two different things. One is that there's clearly a distinction between different forms of wealth creation. I want people to draw a distinction between what I call, productive and extractive wealth creation. Productive wealth creation is you make something that makes people's lives better. When people cooperate in complicated ways that that improve their well-being, there's something you call the cooperative surplus, right? Like there's suddenly more in the world to spread around. And if you create a ton of surplus and take a bit of it, you can end up incredibly rich. But that's not because you took it from anybody, right? It's because you created so much surplus that a very small share ends up being a ton of money. And I think that's important to make that distinction right at the beginning. There's a big difference between different ways to get rich. So secondarily, which I bear down on, is I myself have gotten pretty disillusioned with the very idea of ideology. I just want to look at what actually works, what the data say, and what. So I've become consequently like a connoisseur of, uh, you know, what you call the social indicators literature. You know, all of the metrics and measures and indices that you can use to try to get a bead on how people are faring in different places. So, like, what's the level of inequality? What's the level of literacy? What, how many people don't have healthcare coverage? What is the level of economic freedom according to some definition of economic freedom? Like, how well educated people are, blah blah blah. Right? There's a billion of these things, and the most impressive thing about them is that it's the same countries at the top of all of them. And American politics and politics in most advanced liberal democracies, the main axis of contention is between different versions of the same basic regime type, which I call, there's not a good name for it, so it's a mouthful, but I call it, liberal democratic welfare state capitalism. It just wins in all of these rankings. So there's a social democratic version, and there's kind of subversions. There's the Nordic kind of model of social democracy, and there's a kind of more Western European, like the French-German model, which is each has its own idiosyncrasies, but that's a general the Northern and Western European social democratic model. And then there's more of the English-speaking countries, United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the UK itself. So a lot of these, formerly English colonies, including Hong Kong and Singapore, which are both a little more authoritarian. All these places show up at the tops of all these rankings, right? So if you're Dan Riffle and you're being and you want to find evidence that something is a policy failure that isn't just generated by a theory that you have about like when inequality is and isn't good for people, or when it is or isn't toxic to democratic institutions. Like if you wanted to find out whether billionaires are policy failures, you'd go and look at all the places that are the biggest policy successes according to metrics that measure things that most of us care about. Where do people live the longest? Where are people the happiest? Right. Where are the people the wealthiest? Where do people have the best general overall health? Right. Like, and you can measure equality. You can measure economic freedom. You can measure personal freedom. So on and so forth, right? Like, so whatever your metric is of policy success, you can go try to measure that, and then you can go try to rank the countries according to your way of doing that measurement, and then see what you get, right? Well, you get the same countries over and over in all these different things. It cuts it. So you can get a kind of a left-wing measurement like the Social Progress Index, or you can get a right-wing measurement like the Cato Fraser economic freedom index, and you end up with the same group of countries, right? Like how you define the terms is gonna, and everything is always ideologically loaded to some extent. But what's really fascinating is that the ideological weightings on these indices aren't enough to make it the case that the same list of countries just doesn't come out over and over again. It can have an effect on your rank, right? Like Denmark comes out about as well as the United States on economic freedom according to Cato's index. They would come out a lot better if Cato didn't penalize size of government and tax burden so heavily in their notion of economic freedom. But still, like, even though they do, impose a big penalty, Denmark comes out, at least as free as the United States in terms of, a libertarian notion of economic freedom. And I don't want to belabor this point, or I do. No, I do want to belabor this point, because I do belabor, like, people still haven't quite gotten around to grasping the full import of the fact that uh, that it's basically one general regime type that is the best we've ever done, and that our right-left politics are about very small differences. Like, I'm talking in terms of like economic and social policy, not so much in terms of uh, you know uh, racial, ethnic hierarchy and stuff like that. Like, but just in terms of what the political economy model is, and the disputes between the left and the right on those things. Like those are actually really small disputes within a very, you know, a cluster of models that have a lot of family resemblances. Um, but that's how you find out what's successful. That's why, like, if you want to know what's a policy success, you just go and look, and and you can pick anything you want. You can see, like, I like equality, I like freedom, I like people living a hell of a long time, and you can see what you like, and you can see what countries do the best. And it's the same countries that do the best on just about everything, unless you have really horrible values. Like, I really like the subjugation of ethnic minorities, right? Like, okay, well, that's not going to be those countries. But that general class of liberal democratic capitalist welfare states shows up again and again. So those are the successes. Do they have a lot of billionaires in them? They do. They do have a lot of billionaires in them. And so, the chart that we drew out for the piece just ranks countries by their Human Development Index score and their concentration of billionaires. Like, how many billionaires per capita are there in that country? And the United States comes out like 13 in the Human Development Index, and it comes out like 10, I think, in billionaires per capita. But what's telling is that there are quite a number of countries that both score higher on the Human Development Index and have a higher concentration of billionaires. And these are already the places that are doing the best in terms of various metrics of human well-being. And the better you do, the more likely it is that you have a high concentration of billionaires. That ought to, that ought to be important to you. That's definitely a significant and indicative piece of evidence. And you can give an account of why this is the case, right? Liberal democratic institutions that are strong and fair, that are governed by a rule of law, where private property rights are well enforced and well defined, where there are relatively competitive markets that are well regulated. Those are places that generate a lot of innovation and economic growth, and a high level of economic growth really does bring everyone else along, right? Like that's not necessarily the case. People do get left behind, which is why all these places have developed a model for redistributing some of the gains of growth back to the bottom. The United States does especially dismally at that. But it's not because we have more billionaires, because we don't. So like that in a nutshell is the case. Like, if you just take empirical evidence seriously, are places that are policy successes, do they have billionaires in them? Do they have the most billionaires in them? And yes, they do, right? That's important. Do they have a lot of billionaires for reasons that are closely related to the reasons that they do so well in terms of all these other things? Yes, they do. Places that incentivize high levels of innovation and growth tend to create a ton of material progress, which, by the way, tends to encourage the liberalization of values over time. And that process, which brings people up and makes very generous welfare states possible, um, also tends to generate some billionaires. Right? And now, as I mentioned in the piece, um, I think that a lot of our billionaires are too rich, right? Like the rules aren't necessarily fair, and so that's the other thing that I want to sort of push the conversation toward is an emphasis on the rules of the game and the fairness of the rules of the game, as opposed to the outcomes, the patterns that emerge from people playing a game according to fair rules. Now, a good set of rules for interaction in economic and social life is one that creates the kind of results that we see in all of these different social indicators, indices of equality, freedom, human development, what have you. Right? That's you want rules that produce those results. If those rules produce billionaires, that's fine, unless you can show that there's some specific problem that the billionaires cause, or that if there is a set of rules that would produce fewer billionaires, but would leave everybody else better off, then you should have that rule, right? Like that would be the best rule. You should adopt that rule. My rule of thumb is like this basic kind of, sometimes philosophers call it sufficitarian, but like the kind of Rawlsian idea and the difference principle, which is that inequalities are justified just in case the least well-off class, the poor and working classes are doing as well as they can, right? If having less inequality would raise the prospects of the least well-off, then you should adopt the rule that leads to less inequality. But if the rule that over time tends to maximize the well-being of the least well-off class also produces some big concentrations of wealth, that's fine. Right. Now, there's a whole separate issue, and I'm not going to get into it here, but there's an important item of ideological conviction on the progressive and social democratic left that once wealth inequality gets so high that the wealthy as a class will coordinate and act in the political system in a way that rigs the system permanently to their advantage, guts all of our rights, and so on and so forth. I think that's a serious argument and has to be taken really, really seriously. And the question is, if it's true, what rules do we need to have to prevent the baleful consequences of over-concentrated wealth? But it's actually hard to show that that's true. And the rules are harder than you'd think. So one of the things that I toyed with when I was writing this piece, putting in as well, is that there are indices of democracy, right? Like what you're worried about is the integrity of democratic systems, the equality of rights, the equal worth of people's rights. There are things that try to measure that. The Economist Democracy Index is pretty good. It has a bunch of different inputs into the index that all get weighted, and you just see the same countries, right? And again, some of the same countries that have the highest scores in the democracy index also have like the largest number of billionaires per capita, right? So again, prima facie, the idea that having a lot of mega rich people as a proportion of your population, that is, ipso facto corrosive of democratic institutions. Like the data don't show that. Now, there are all sorts of ways in which money in politics is completely corrosive. The question is whether just the mere existence of large fortunes is corrosive, and the evidence for that is pretty thin on the ground. Okay, that was more just talking than I had intended to do. That's what happens. I always intend to talk less than I actually do. So let's deal with some of these questions that we have. Okay. John Schmidt says, "What do you make of the fact that Scandinavian Americans who have a higher standard of living than the general American population, and also Scandinavians who live in Scandinavia?" What do I make of that fact? Well, that's complicated. I have some thoughts on that. I don't know, an, a quarter. I'm a quarter Norwegian. No, I'm an eighth Norwegian. My grandmother was half Norwegian. That makes me like an eighth. My great-grandfather was named Einar Ofstedal, and they were immigrants to, not to the United States, but to Canada. And what do I make of the fact that that sort of North American immigrant Scandinavians do better than Scandinavians in Scandinavia and the general American population? Okay, two things. One is that American institutions have proven just excellent at producing a high standard of living. People don't give the U.S. and again, like I just want to caveat so people don't argue with me about the wrong thing. I think we don't have nearly enough redistribution to people at the bottom, right? Like I think we could do tons more to make sure that the least well-off are much better off. I think there are free lunches all over the place that by failing to make sure that everybody has enough to develop their basic capacities to get a decent education, we've got like a vast amount of productive potential that's just being kind of locked down and squandered, right? Like I think growth rates would be higher if we had more redistribution. So I just don't want people to think that I'm arguing against redistribution. But despite the fact that the United States doesn't do great at redistribution relative to a lot of countries, still our least well-off class still does very, very, very well relative to the rest of the world, because the U.S. as a whole has done such a good job of wealth creation that does, over time, trickle down, despite the everybody's hatred of the phrase. It just doesn't trickle down enough, and it takes too long for people who've been displaced. So that's just one thing. So because the U.S. has some of the world's best institutions in terms of just generating wealth, you'll tend to see any ethnic group in the United States having a higher standard of living than that ethnic group elsewhere. Some of it's just U.S. institutions. Two, migration selection effects, right? Like this is the love of my life. I've been working on this paper for a year about the filtering effects of internal migration in the United States and urbanization, and there's a large literature on international immigration and selection effects, and it is pretty clear that the people who take off have at least a certain kind of initiative that people who tend to stay don't have. Like, so the fact that somebody has migrated is an indication of something important about them that tends to correlate with higher income. So that's another thing. And then the most ephemeral variable is just culture. I don't think much of data about group differences between ethnicities in terms of sort of fundamental cognitive attributes. I just don't think the differences are big enough to explain a lot. There do seem to be important cultural differences that explain differences in cultures. So that's a long-winded answer to that question. But I think American institutions generate a lot of wealth. Immigrants who come here are the intrepid, entrepreneurial sort of individuals who tend to do well, and Scandinavian culture is I would say healthy in a number of ways in terms of interfaces well with the requirements of profit-seeking capitalist societies. They're extremely cooperative, high-trust people who are good at enforcing good norms. All right. Scandinavians rank higher on most economic freedom indices than the neoliberal countries. Charn Murray says, yeah, I mean, it's just like it's just kind of a push. On the right-leaning economic freedom indices, the top scoring countries tend to be neoliberal countries, right? Like often they put Hong Kong at the top. That's just like an error. Hong Kong's not its own country anymore, even though its institutions are distinct from mainland China. I think it doesn't count as its own country. Singapore does well as well. It counts, I think, as its own country, but again, it's like a tiny city-state. Doesn't have the same kind of. It's just not the same situation that most countries are in. But then past the Asian Anglo-colonial city-states, you get, New Zealand tends to do really, really well. Australia, Canada does great. But they're all clustered in there, right? Denmark does great, Sweden does great. The U.S. does totally mediocre. We do not have a particularly free market. I just wish people would get over it. It kind of sucks here in a lot of ways. I'm really quiet. That sucks. Next time I do this, I will get all the settings taken care of. I'll just get closer to the microphone. No, don't apologize. I'm glad to know. CTM Game says if Sweden had as many people as the U.S. but still had the same institutions, would they still be richer and healthier than the U.S.? That's a hard question to answer off the cuff. So, other things equal, more people are better, right? So, you get more extensive division of labor. You get better sort of agglomeration effects. There's just people produce things, and so more of them produce more, and there's complementarities. There are things that you can do with 3 people that 2 people can't do at all, right? And there are things you can do with 100 people that you can't do at all with 50 people. There's lots of things like that, and people are always figuring them out. But you just have more options. If you have more people, you get so more people. You're going to get higher levels of growth with good institutions. The question, in terms of the comparative political economy literature, isn't really the size of the country so much, in terms of its population. It's more to do with the variation in the population. So one of the most distinctive things about the Nordic countries is that they're, extremely homogeneous. There's not a lot of internal diversity, and part of that is due to good things about a number of those countries, which is that they didn't have the kind of full-on expansive colonial aspirations that other European countries had. There's some some extent to which diversity reflects a history of colonial subjugation and oppression, and so that tends to go along with uh, segregation, status hierarchies, and stuff like that. So population diversity, like just by itself, isn't necessarily bad for things like social trust. Um, the literature actually suggests that you can't find any negative consequence on, and I'm talking about social trust because social trust is you know is basically mutual expectations of what other people are gonna do, right? Like, do I believe that if I follow the rules, others will follow the rules as well? And if I think that if I, don't litter, that everybody else won't litter as well. Like, if I trust that everybody else isn't going to litter, I'm not going to litter, right? Like I'm less likely to. If everybody else litters, then like my not littering doesn't make that much of a difference, doesn't contribute that. Like, that's kind of the sort of thing that like social trust kind of captures is the extent to which people can expect that other people are going to comply with kind of pro-social norms. And a crack that people make about diversity is that it's corrosive to social trust, and so maybe you see uh, welfare states being much more ample and generous in these Nordic countries because they have less diversity, and there's definitely something to that, but it's not a clear first order effect of diversity per se, because like what you actually find has the negative effect from social trust, from what has the effect of the negative effects on social trust don't come from diversity by itself. It comes from segregation, and segregation is toxic, and for all sorts of reasons. I highly recommend Ryan Enos's book. I think it's called "The Space Between Us," about segregation. Um, so you, if so it like thinking realistically. So sorry, that seems like a long aside, but I promise it's really not. Um, so it depends on like how Sweden gets as many people as the United States. If it gets it through uh, diverse migration, um, as opposed to just like you know incredible birth rates. I don't know how they would get American populations uh, without some miracle. Like, would they still be richer and healthier than the United States? Um, it kind of depends on like if you say and they have the same institutions, then yeah, they do, right? Like holding the institutions constant, just more people gives you more. Uh, but do those institutions stay constant is really the question that people tend to have about immigration, um, and that depends. Like it depends on how well integrated, uh, uh, like minority groups are in the rest of society, and places that have a high level of diversity, in fact, tends to have really nasty histories of segregation, right? Like that like, and so these things can get uh, blurred together. Um, did that answer the question? Would they still be so basically my answer to the question is simply yes. Um, but but then I would question whether it would be possible for them to get as big as the United States and maintain the same institutions because the politics would change a lot. Okay. And so the larger question then you had is, can we know if these institutions scale? Like yeah, no, we don't. Like you don't know if institutions scale. This is why politics and policy are hard. Um, like you can see something working in one place, and not know whether it's going to just work in even slightly different circumstances, right? Like nothing nothing ever works the way you think it's going to. There's always unintended consequences. There's always sort of like weird ramifying effects that nobody had any inkling of. So you don't really know if they scale. Like that's why I like to look at these big sets of a bunch of different kinds of countries, right? So if you can show that like countries that are much, some really geographically big, some really populous, some like geographically smaller, some more homogeneous, some more heterogeneous, right? And you see a set of institutions working well in all of those places, uh, like across all of those axes of difference, then that's really good evidence that those institutions are generally portable. Um, but like there are things that I really doubt that the United States can maintain a like a Danish style system for a lot of reasons, and I don't think that the oh like look it's a tiny relatively ethnically homogenous place Denmark, um, it, like we're not going to be able to do that. I don't think that's a glib thing to say. I think it's probably true that there are a lot of things that a country that size, that has that level of consensus in terms of cultural values, that doesn't have like really super deep embittered in group out group politics. Like there's things that those kinds of countries can do that we can't do. But there are a lot of things that like we need to like be paying more attention to from countries like Denmark than we do currently. Like the Nordic welfare state regimes um are just the overall contour of those systems, like have a lot to do with the fact that they are small. So their internal markets are relatively small. If they want to have high rates of growth, they're going to have foreign markets. They don't have big enough domestic markets to support domestic manufacturers of everything that they need. So if they get wealthy and they want to buy stuff, they're going to have to buy it from other people, right? Like, and so just that kind of size makes them really exposed to trade, right? Like, and so that makes those countries extremely open to trade because that's what everything depends on it, right? Like, there aren't enough Swedes in Sweden to sell Saabs to, right? Like, you need open markets, right? And so those are people sometimes don't get how like aggressively neoliberal in terms of the international trade regime, like those countries that sometimes people think of as socialist can be. Like their growth and economic well-being and consequently their level of redistributive generosity depends on their openness to global trade. Like it's not accidental. I mean, it probably is accidental in some ways, but it's not a huge coincidence that like Maersk is like the dominant container shipping company in the world. They move just gigantic like quantities of goods all around the world. Like so this company from tiny Denmark is like a huge part of the infrastructure of global capitalism. Um, and and so the dynamism of those countries really does reflect the fact that they're small countries, super trade exposed, and don't necessarily have large domestic markets. Um, it, Things have been different in the United States for a long time because it's a huge country. It has vast internal markets. We haven't, we can support manufacturers in all sorts of different areas. It might not be most economical to do it here, but we, like the market's big enough. And so things have been different for us. But like the United States is shrinking as a portion of the world economy, right? So over time, the United States, as India grows, and think of the growth rates that India and China have, and just like extrapolate forward 50 years, right? Like, the, you know, the, 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 the U.S. as a size, as a portion of the global market, is going to be more Sweden-like, right? Like we're going to be a smaller fish in a bigger pond. And there are a lot of things that those countries do well that we don't do well, that we need to learn how to do better, and that we could do, that are generalizable from their experience. But we don't have the motivation to do them because we don't face the same kind of geopolitical, international economic reality. Okay. Neoliberal says, I love your webcam, Will. I love that you love my webcam. Neoliberal CTM Game says, why is so much about the debate about the Nordic model? Isn't the German model of Rhine capitalism or social Marktwirtschaft much better suited to a heterogeneous society? It's a good question. I don't really have a good theory of why it is that people want to talk so much about the Nordic model as opposed to the German model. I suspect it has something to do with the complexity of Germany. World War II, they kind of almost ruined the world, and then it got split in half, and so you had two competing German economic models, and then you had to fuse them back together, and that was a drag on that integration dragged down West German growth for a while, and still has some knock-on effects that aren't great. And so I think there's something about just the really peculiar historical circumstances of Germany that makes it people more wary of generalizing from the successes of their model. That's my guess about why we don't talk about the German model as much. But there's a ton to learn from it. I wish I knew more. I don't have. I for some reason I got sucked into learning about Denmark and Sweden, a decade ago. But I haven't put in the same kind of study and understanding how the German system works. I have a vague sense of it, but not a super strong one. Of course, Germany still isn't as diverse as the United States. Yeah, that's right. And Germany's having a lot of problems adapting to changing economic realities now. Everybody has a trouble adapting to changing economic realities now. I wouldn't be hard on Germany. I think they're doing great. Looks pretty good. Their attitude towards the European Central Bank might not be ideal. Their sort of imperial attitude toward the rest of the EU might not be ideal. But they're I just again, I just want a brief for the importance of just seeing things comparatively. Germany's fucking great. It's a great place to live. It's amazing. The neoliberal, what is the curse of Matt Bruenig? Matt is why we talk about the Nordics more than Germany. Maybe. But the thing, I feel like we were talking. I feel like I was talking about Denmark and Sweden before Matt, a younger man than I, came on the scene. And so I think that somehow it was already going on. And some of the stuff that he's into, nobody else was talking about. The Norwegian, social wealth fund sort of stuff, sovereign wealth fund, isn't something that people have been talking about until he really pushed it. CTM Game says one hallmark is that historically much of the Social Security was effectively privatized. But like, was it privatized where? CTM in the Nordics? Because that is true. Uh, Sweden at least has a sorta privatized Social Security system, but they're all kind of complicated hybrids. Um, uh, but that's a good example of an issue where the the left right differences are just stupidly overblown. I mean, like Social Security might not be in some sort of like huge fiscal problem like people made it out when Bush was trying to move to Social Security private accounts. Um, but again, like it's a system that works fine. It works fine in Chile. It works fine in its Swedish iteration. Like there's just not that big of a difference between forcing people to save money and and uh, and then like having them pay taxes, spending it, and then giving money back to them, right? The difference between intrapersonal and interpersonal redistribution isn't that huge, especially when there's going to be a fair amount of interpersonal redistribution anyway, to make sure that everybody gets up to like the threshold of the minimum. So like, oh, it was privatized in Germany. Okay. See, and people don't like I didn't know that. Like, I'm sure I read about it at some point. Um, uh, but like that's what's important. Like you have to actually go look. And so like if I just like came on CNN and was like, time to privatize Social Security, like people on the left are just gonna go ape shit. But like part of it's just gonna be out of ignorance about like maybe I just want to do what the Germans have done or what the Swedes have done, and because I think it's working okay there, and but nobody's gonna be like, we don't want to be like like Germany and Sweden, right? Like the people just don't know how systems work. Like my own ignorance is completely indicative of that. Uh, Tarosian says, vague question. In your article, you talk about billionaires who became such by being innovators. What about the subsequent billions from investment returns? For example, if I become a billionaire by innovating something, great. But did I earn a second billion if the first thing turns into two while I'm sitting on my island doing nothing? Possibly yes. Not trying to make this leading. That's a good question, right? Like once you have a lot of money, your average market return is gonna make you a lot more money. That's why like a wealth tax doesn't hurt as much as people might think, because if it kicks in at like 50 billion or whatever, like the average return on 49 billion is pretty good, and most people aren't going to have a huge amount over that who the tax applies to. So it doesn't hit you as much as you might think, because just pure financial gains are very high. Did you like so? Did you earn it? If you invested it and made the market gains. Yeah, I mean, I don't really like. So I did put a thing in the piece about like the difference between, there being kind of a rough distinction between the deserving and undeserving rich. But I don't really think anybody deserves anything in some deep sense. What matters is whether the rules that are structuring property rights, that structure market interaction, are leading to the kinds of results we want over the long term, right? So ideas about moral desert are not the most important ideas. I'm very much Hayekian in this. Like we're not thinking about. It's hard to evaluate distribution morally. Like if you know how markets work, right? Like it like you don't, if for whatever reason you just happen to have, the only, like, pomegranate patch in your town, and pomegranates become wildly popular, you might make a mint. But did you deserve it? Like, who knows, right? And sometimes, like, you go to school to learn how to be like a particular kind of engineer or something like that, and it's kind of a dopey job, or blah blah blah, and then there's some tech breakthrough that just like makes demand for your particular thing go through the roof, and all of a sudden you're making like 5 times more every year than you would have otherwise, and like did you deserve to like have the thing that caused demand for your services to spike? No. Like, so there's like some sense in which, like in some deep metaphysical sense, you don't deserve. Like computer scientists don't deserve to have higher salaries than teachers. It's just that the labor markets demand their services more because they contribute more to increases in productivity of other stuff in the economy, right? Like, so like, yeah, so a lot of it, like, so it's not like a question about desert and earning it so much. There is a, like, there's a distinction that I like to make. There's a kind of a deep and shallow notion of desert. Like, if I, tell you that I'm going to tile your bathroom, and I give you a quote, and we sign a contract, and 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 so it's, you're going to owe me $500 for this, and then subsequently, um, like the market rates for the service go up, um, or say market services for this go down, right? Like after you signed the contract to have me, tile your bathroom, you could get somebody to do it for $300, right? So then at the end of this, I've tiled your bathroom, and I'm saying, okay, you owe me $500 now because that's what we agreed on, and you say, like, well, sorry, like now the market value of the service is like $300, so I'm giving you $300. Like, there is a sense in which I deserve that $500, right? Like, and there's a sense in which, like, when they give me that $500, they promised me they'd give me if I tiled their bathroom, there's like a totally clear, common sense way in which I earned that money, even though I didn't deserve like to have labor market conditions such that I would earn 500 rather than 3, right? Like, so I think it's important to be careful about like, because people with like really strong metaphysical senses of desert tend to be weirdly denialist about the fact that people do, like if you sign an agreement with somebody that they're going to do something for you, like you deserve, like you're owed what they agreed to do, and if you did, if you performed the task and you came through, you deserve to get what you were promised, even if you don't deserve in any deep sense that is more money than something that somebody else does, right? Anyway, tangent, but I think that's an important point. So so the question is, like, what would be the better use of that money that is being invested into the market, right? So if somebody's sitting on their first $1 billion, they've invested it all in the market. If they're making a ton of money back, it's because like over the long term and on average, it's because that money is actually contributing to the productivity of the economy, and you want people plowing tons of money into activities that enhance the productivity and growth of the economy. Like, is it optimal to like tax them on capital gains at the level that we do? Those are tough questions. But like, I don't think it's a very important question whether somebody has earned their capital income. It's the important question is whether a rule that takes some of it away from them and does something else with it would leave people better off than what we do. That's not really a satisfying answer, but I think that's the best I can do. Germany privatization. There were private but highly regulated insurance funds. Just called Social Security privatization, German-style socialism. Yeah. I just wish I could get people off of like the socialist capitalist binaries, it's just not helpful. Um, Everything's just like a big stew of market and political institutions, and there's a lot of way to calibrate similar stuff using different mixes of institutions, and it doesn't matter as much as people think it does. And then John Schmidt, and I think this will wrap it up for today. John says America should look to Switzerland and Australia instead of Sweden for inspiration. Parochialism of American conservatives cause them to ignore Switzerland and Australia. Really? Well, so again, like Switzerland's weird. It's hard to make sense of Switzerland. It's great. It's one of our actually existing utopias. So gotta love Switzerland. But it's hard to know what you can learn from it. Like other than just like being like, hey, they have this policy that it works and we should do it, which is like, you know, the Swiss healthcare system works with the same sort of general structure that Obamacare is supposed to work in, except they'll actually freaking dock your pay and put you in jail if you try not to buy insurance. The mandate has teeth, and that makes it work. So yeah, I mean, but basically any country that shows up over and over and over again at the tops of all of these lists, like you should just like if you're like doing tax policy, you should just go and look. Like what do the Swiss do? What do the Swedes do? What do the Finns do? like what do they like? You know, and people do. You know, there's quite a few different options in places where things work relatively similarly well. So yeah, I mean, Australia does really well on a lot of metrics as well. What are they doing that's so awesome? And like the thing is, like conservative people on the right don't like comparative approaches, partly because like just like the whole ideology of American exceptionalism, it like creates a lot of resistance to the idea of taking other countries seriously, like or thinking that anything will apply because we're like a special snowflake of a nation that has been, you know, blessed with God's special grace, and we're this providential force in world history, and so things that apply to other countries just they don't apply to us. So like if every one of these other countries that is incredibly successful on any metric that you can pick all have like some form of you know universal government supported, you know, like healthcare, that doesn't matter. Like, you know, we're Americans. It's not what we do, right? Like, so that's frustrating. People on the left tend to project their fantasies about what they would like their country to be like on other countries without actually knowing how they work, how capitalist they really are, like whether they actually have a privatized social security system or not, that kind of thing. Hi, Will. Why do you think dividing numbers of billionaires by population is some profound shit? Why should numbers of billionaires have a linear relationship with population? I don't think dividing numbers of billionaires by population is particularly profound. It's just very large places have more of everything. And if you're worried about the concentration of wealth, is that extremely wealthy people can use their power to gang up on the rest of us and rig institutions to their advantage through the political system, then and you have a democratic political system, then the proportion of those people to the rest of the population is what's important. I think. I don't think the number of billionaires would because I think other things equal, more people will tend to produce a higher rate of growth. You would expect bigger countries to produce more billionaires per capita because of the advantages that size gives their economies. And in that context, it's really interesting that the United States lags behind a country like Sweden. Ninja Fortnite says, just turned on. This guy is a liberal, huh? It's true. I'm a liberal. Fox columnist, New York Times. So you're a propagandist. I like to think of myself as an empirically minded public policy professional. I try to avoid doing propaganda and try to be intellectually rigorous and fair. That's what I try. Man, we never live up to our own ideals, do we? All right. Well, thank you for everybody for showing up. Kind of thought I'd get more specific billionaire questions or distributive justice questions. But, you know, it's the first time I tried doing this. So I probably got a relatively self-selected set of people who are more inclined to agree with me than disagree with me. So hopefully next time I'll get more people who disagree with me. Thanks for coming, and have a great rest of your day. And we'll try this again when the next piece comes around. And maybe we don't even have to wait till I write something. Maybe we can just talk about something that's like in the news. All right, thanks guys. Take it easy.